Hi, my name is Kristen Masco, and I lead the mental health and well-being team here at Google. We are thrilled to have you all here today to engage in our discussion with Dr. Jud Brewer, who is here to discuss his book, Unwinding Anxiety. New science shows how to break the cycles of worry and fear to heal your mind. Dr. Brewer is a New York Times best-selling author and thought leader in the field of habit change and the science of self-mastery. He blends over 20 years of experience with mindfulness training and a career in scientific research. As a psychiatrist and internationally known expert in mindfulness training for treating addictions, Dr. Jud has developed and tested novel mindfulness programs for habit change, including both in-person and app-based treatments for anxiety. Unwinding Anxiety is the app, emotional eating, Eat Right Now is the app, and smoking, Craving to Quit is his app. Dr. Brewer is the Director of Research and Innovation at Brown University's Mindfulness Center, where he also serves as the Associate Professor at the School of Public Health and Psychiatry at the School of Medicine at Brown University. So for everyone listening, please feel free to add your questions to the YouTube chat as we go along, and we will save the last 15 minutes for Dr. Jud to answer your questions. And with that, let's welcome Dr. Jud Brewer. Hello, really good to see you. Thank you for writing this really important book. As a neuroscientist, as well as someone who personally struggles with anxiety, I found this book really helpful and insightful. So thank you. To start us out, I'd love for you just to tell us a bit about your background. So you're a psychiatrist, you have a background in addiction research. I'd love to hear about your background prior to this book, how you define addiction, the range of addictions that you see in the modern world.
Yeah. Well, first off, it's great to be here with you. And I would say my background has been kind of that long and winding road, but the more twists and turns there are, the more interesting it gets. So, during my MD PhD program, I wasn't even interested or focused on psychiatry at all. I just started meditating as a way to kind of understand how my own mind worked and decrease my own stress. And as I went through that program, I was thinking, wow, it's really helpful to kind of know how my mind works. And that prompted me and kind of inspired me to go into psychiatry, where some of the things I was learning from some of the ancient Buddhist concepts behind the mindfulness training were actually showing up in my clinic. My patients were speaking the same language, so to speak. So I became a psychiatry resident and started learning, all the different ways to practice psychiatry, and really fell in love with addictions and addiction treatment. There weren't a lot of great treatments. There's a lot of stigmatization, a lot of self-judgment and shame and all of that. And so I was thinking, wow, this is an important area to work in. And I started, kind of retooling to learn neuroscience and do neuroimaging, and even retooled to do clinical trials because I'd mostly been doing molecular biology research in my PhD years. Mm-hmm. And as I started working as an addiction psychiatrist, I'm sure this was a lot of my inexperience, but it was really hard. Like, it is really hard to treat addictions. And all the standard tools I'd learned weren't really helping my patients, whether it was trying to quit smoking or work with heroin or cocaine or alcohol or whatever. And those the basic standard approach, which is still applied today, is really based on willpower. And so maybe we can bookmark that and talk more about that later. But what got me into looking at anxiety in particular was this idea around, about 1 in 5 patients is helped with an anxiety medication, like the best ones that we have. There's this term in medicine called number needed to treat, which is 5.2. And so I'm basically playing the medication lottery and struggling because 1 in 5, is still better than the regular lottery. But, I didn't know which of my 5 patients was going to benefit and then what to do with the other 4. And so I started looking at the mechanisms to see what I was missing. And it turns out back in the 80s, this guy, Tom Borkovec, and others were starting to talk about anxiety as a habit. And I was thinking, I never learned this in residency. I never learned this in medical school, but I know something about habits. I've been helping people with habits for a while. And we developed programs like our smoking program. Our first study, we got 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment, and with our Eat Right Now app, we'd gotten 40% reduction in craving-related eating. So I was thinking, what if we bring together anxiety and habit formation and treat it mechanistically that way? So that's kind of the background that kind of got me into this. It was my own my own interest in my own mind and my own suffering. And then also my suffering in trying to help my patients is not being effective at doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really excited to get back in later in the conversation to talk more about the distinction between willpower and what you recommend, because I think it's such a different approach. So early in the book, you share your wife's description, describing her own anxiety. And I thought it was one of the best descriptions I have read, which is she describes it as a low-grade feeling that has no object in itself.
Mm-hmm.
It attaches to any particular situation or thought that it can. It's as though my mind is looking for something to be anxious about. And I loved that phrase, because as someone who deals with anxiety, that's exactly what it feels like. It's like the anxiety is there and it's looking for something to attach to. And so you kind of go on to talk about the distinction between fear, planning, and anxiety. And I thought it was a very useful distinction and would love to hear kind of your description of that for those listening.
Yeah, that's a really interesting and important distinction, because 2 of the 3 are helpful.
Exactly. Yeah. It's the combination. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's start with fear. Our brains don't like uncertainty. Okay. If there's uncertainty, it signals, hey, you got to figure out if there's danger out there, and so if let's say that you're asleep at night and you hear a strange noise in your apartment or your house, and, is your brain going to be like, oh, whatever, I'm just going to sleep? No, our brain, we wake up, we're hyper vigilant. What was that? I have to go figure out what that was. And once we figure it out, or at least it doesn't, continue to the point where we feel comfortable enough going back to sleep, we can go back to sleep. So that is uncertainty in our brain saying, figure out that's dangerous. And in this similar mechanism, you can think of, when we don't have food, our stomach rumbles and says, go get food. Information is like food for our brain. If we don't have information, our brain says, go get it. Okay. And that's these basic fear mechanisms. Really helpful. That's why they're baked in. So if you look at kind of some of the newer evolutionary processes, think of them that way, is planning. So in modern day, planning, very helpful for survival, and also very pragmatic, for planning a trip. It's helpful to plan, not just to say, oh, I'll just go to the airport and see if there are tickets, whenever I can get a ticket. So planning's helpful. But when you bring that present moment fear together with future oriented planning, and you kind of mush those together, you get fear of the future. And that fear says, go get information. But because it's in the future, we can't get that information. And so that just gets on this endless loop of worry, which in fact, it's like seizing up our computer. It doesn't help us plan. It doesn't help us survive. In fact, it's antithetical to survival. It doesn't, anxiety is bad for us physically and mentally. And so this weird little, glitch in the program, so to speak, where it's like helpful, when you put those 2 together, not helpful, I think it's really fascinating, because lots of people say, well, I need anxiety to help me do stuff. And in fact, there's no evidence to show that anxiety is helpful for getting, whether it's performance anxiety or whatever. There are tons of myths on the internet around performance anxiety. I wrote a little bit about it in the book, but there's one called this Yerkes-Dodson curve, where people say you need some optimal level of anxiety to perform well, and too little or too much is not good for you. That's based on a 1907 study of Japanese dancing mice, where they looked at arousal, right? Arousal is not anxiety. Arousal is, like if you're asleep, you're not going to perform well. If you're totally freaked out, you're not going to perform well, So arousal in Japanese dancing mice makes sense for an inverted U-shaped curve, not so much for humans. In fact, there's an inverse relationship. The more anxious you are, the worse you perform. And we all can just look at our own experience and ask ourselves, do I perform better at whatever I'm doing when I'm anxious? No. And if you look at the opposite of anxiety, like flow, when somebody's totally in the zone, they're coding, they're doing whatever, and they're just like, time goes away, they go away, they merge, it's the merging of self and object. That's optimal performance, and flow is just tremendously joyful. It is the opposite of anxiety.
Yeah. Yeah. One follow-up question on that is there a distinction there between eustress and destress? So like eustress being kind of a healthy, positive stress, distress being a negative stress. So like some level of arousal is needed to be able to attend, if you're so disengaged that you're kind of at the point of feeling bored, that you're not going to perform as well. Is that where the Yerkes-Dodson curve has value?
So arousal, certainly, right? If we're
Yeah.
falling
Yeah.
asleep, not going to perform well.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
sign of good performance. The nodding. So arousal is certainly helpful. And if you look at, some level, it's interesting if you look at like flow, for example. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi talks about this optimal level of when you're, you've got to have some level of where a task is just challenging enough, but not too
Yeah.
challenging. So that's also slightly different than the arousal piece. But if you think of it, it also makes sense where if we're bored, we're more likely to have our minds wander, and that tends to be a default, state of mind. But if we're totally freaked out, we're
Yeah.
also going to not be able to perform because we're focused on that freaked outness. And when we're freaked out, our prefrontal cortex, our brain can't actually work optimally. Our prefrontal cortex goes offline. So if you look at flow, they talk about finding this optimal zone. But if you look at it, what it really highlights is when we're kind of, there's this ease, this openness. And when we're bored, we tend to be caught up in our wandering
Yeah.
mind, right? And when we're freaked out, we tend to be caught up in that. And that freaked out piece relates very well with anxiety. There's neuroimaging studies showing that this default mode network of the brain, the self-referential processing network of the brain, gets activated. The more worried we are, the more activated it gets. It also gets activated when we're mind wandering, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I just say that because my lab's done studies with expert meditators and even novice meditators, and we find that that same default mode network gets quiet when somebody's meditating. And that's
Mhm.
where, we're opening to our experience rather than, getting caught up in it.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a really helpful distinction. And the idea that at the low and the high end of arousal, you're in a more self-focused place, whereas when you're in that mid spot with flow, you're actually focused on the task that you're doing.
Yeah.
Awesome. So I wanted to talk in your book, I think throughout your different addiction research, you refer to these three gears. So first gear, second gear, and third gear in terms of how people can work with various addictions. So let's start with first gear, which you have defined as mapping out your mind, mapping out your habit loops. Can you tell us what is a habit loop and how can someone go about mapping one?
Sure. So a habit loop is really this very evolutionarily conserved process. We have these, sea slugs have them, the most, I don't want to say, let's just say the simplest of nervous systems, about 20,000 neurons. And in fact, Eric Kendall got the Nobel Prize showing that we learn basically the same way as sea slugs. So the necessary and sufficient components are a trigger, a behavior, and a reward or a result. So from an evolutionary standpoint, for our ancestors that didn't have refrigerators and had to remember where food was and where to get it, if they're out on the savannah or in the woods foraging and they see some food, there's the trigger. They eat that food, there's the behavior, and then their stomach sends this dopamine signal to their brain that says, remember what you ate and where you found it. And and then that feeds back and says, hey, next time you're hungry, go there. It's this learning mechanism that helps us lay down what's called a context dependent memory. We lay down a memory that says, hey, go there for food. Same is true for avoiding danger. It's we're out on the savannah. We don't know if there's danger. We see danger. We make a note. Okay, that part of the savannah is dangerous. So that's the basis for what's called positive and negative reinforcement. That trigger, behavior, result feeds back and creates a habit loop that says, oh, if that's good, do it again. If it's bad, don't do, avoid that.
Mm-hmm.
And that habit loop process, maybe I can give a concrete example with, how I work with this clinically is I'll just sit down and map these habit loops out with my patients. So if somebody comes in, a patient that I actually wrote about in the Unwinding Anxiety book, I called him Dave at the time, because he was a patient. Fortunately, he's no longer a patient of mine because he doesn't, he's conquered his anxiety. But he, when he was referred for anxiety, and the first thing we did was map out habit loops around he had panic disorder as well as generalized anxiety disorder. So he had trouble driving. He would get panic attacks driving on the highway. So we would just map out, what was his trigger? He'd have this thought, oh, I'm going to get in a car wreck. And his behavior was to avoid driving on the highway. And then the reward for his brain was that he wouldn't get a panic attack. And so I just pulled out a blank piece of paper. It was actually a sticky note. He just sent me a picture of it the other day. He kept it. This is so he's like, hey, here's the sticky note you sent me home with. So I had the sticky note that said trigger behavior reward. And then so I drew the arrows between the three, and he made this connection that, oh, this is my brain doing its thing. He had never mapped that out before. Yeah. So that's really what the first step is for anyone to be able to map out a habit loop, is just to see what the trigger, behavior, and result is. We can do this with anxiety. We can do this with stress eating. We can do this with procrastinating or anything. And in fact, we even created a free habit map where I think the URL is just mapmyhabit.com. So anybody can download this free PDF and map out their own habits, because that's what I do with my patients, but anybody can do this. So that's that great. First step. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I wanted to see if you could specifically talk about preservative thinking. One thing that really jumped out was I think you wrote that it was like the single top issue that you see with patients who are struggling with anxiety, and that anxiety being sort of forward-looking preservative thinking and depression being backward-looking preservative thinking. So in the context of a habit loop, what reward or perceived reward is someone getting from preservative thinking?
Yeah, so if we map it out so that the trigger could be, just even a feeling of anxiety, and the behavior tends to be worrying. That's what that preservative thinking is, where they're thinking, they're worrying about what might happen in the future. And that worrying, so occasionally, it will either predict, well, I'm going to say predict, but it's actually associated with something that might happen in the future. So they might say, oh, I'm worried about this. And then it happens. And then their brain says, oh, see, you should worry about that because you predicted that it would happen. But it could be true and unrelated. Just because they worried, especially if they worry all the time, then the likelihood that they're going to have a thought and they're going to worry about that thought is pretty high correlation. But simply because they had the thought doesn't mean that worry helped with anything. And in fact, the most solid research shows that preservative thinking, that worrying, makes people feel like they're in control, right? So if somebody feels like, oh, yeah, see, I told you, that gives them some sense of control, but it's only a sense of control. It didn't actually affect, we can't worry our family members safe when they're, when they're out at night or something like that. We can't worry things to happen, but it gives our brain something to do. And that is rewarding enough that it can actually spin these cycles of anxiety until it gets to be too much. And that's when we can help people shift out of those.
Yeah. No, I think that was really helpful, of like this feeling of either distraction from the anxious feelings or a false sense of control is what creates that initial habit loop. All right, so let's move into second gear. This is where it starts getting really fun. So the second gear is updating your brain's reward value. So maybe you can tell us about what is a reward value and how does the brain use it to decide what behaviors to take?
Yeah, so our brains have this region that's involved in a network, but it's one of the main players is called the orbitofrontal cortex, and it's kind of behind our eyes and that's orbito, and in the frontal cortex. And the way that this works is that most habits are helpful for us, but our brain has to set up a sorting mechanism to figure out what decisions to make at any one time. It's kind of like an algorithm where it says, okay, given the choice between two behaviors, you could either try both of them and then learn which is the best one to do, or you could just set up an algorithm that says, in general, I'm going to pick this over this. This is kind of like why our brains will go to cake over broccoli. It's kind of like our brains, from a survival standpoint, cake has more calories, but to our bodies, that we have all these associations with cake tasting good and this and that. And so our brains will go to cake. And so we set up these reward hierarchies. Like if I eat some cake or a piece of chocolate and broccoli, my brain compares the two and says, what would you prefer, cake, chocolate, or broccoli? Chocolate. Let's say I eat some milk chocolate. And then I say, because milk chocolate's not my favorite. So then let's say I eat some dark chocolate and my brain compares dark to milk chocolate. Well, dark chocolate, definitely. And then it's like, okay, is that 70%? Add in, okay, 72%, and then some cayenne and sea salt. You can get the idea where my brain is this very intricate reward hierarchy, of what chocolate. So then if somebody says, hey, what kind of chocolate would you like? Here's, this versus this. My brain's like, all of this, because I've tried all of those things in the past. So that reward hierarchy helps us move through life efficiently and not have to relearn things all the time. Now that can be helpful most of the time, but then it also can get set up to the point where, we can fall into habit loops that are not so helpful. So for example, if we've learned to worry as a kid, or we learned it from our parents or whatever, until it becomes problematic, we're just going to keep doing it habitually. Or if we've learned to overeat, my lab just published a study where, if we have people kind of tap into that reward hierarchy, we can actually measure how quickly that reward value changes. So let me dive into that, double click on that a little bit. So the only way to change a behavior is to change the reward value, right? So my patients come in, it'd be great if I could just, use willpower and say, just stop smoking, just stop overeating, just stop worrying. It'd be one-stop shopping for each of my patients, and my job would be super easy. I could just kick back and be like, okay, ready? Go, stop. It doesn't work that way. So our brains, and we get stuck in this willpower, myth, and we're like, oh, what's wrong with me? I know cigarettes are bad for me. I know I shouldn't overeat. What's wrong with me? There's nothing wrong with us. Nothing wrong with our brains. It's just that we've gotten caught in this societal, myth, I want to say, around willpower. It's like, oh, there's something wrong. I just need more willpower. That's not how our brains work. Our brains work based on reward value. So what we can do instead, and this is what I do in my clinic, is I have my patients smoke a cigarette, and they're like, my doctor just told me to smoke, but I have them pay attention as they smoke, and they realize pretty quickly the cigarettes taste like crap, right? I have a patient who was smoking 40 years. So he reinforced his habit loop like 293,000 times. We calculated it out. And he came back and he said, how did I not notice this? Well, it was a habit. It was paying attention. And as soon as we start paying attention, we can't unsee what we just saw. Like we can't kind of unsee that cigarettes taste like crap. But what that does is it gives our brain what's called a negative prediction error. So we predicted that cigarettes were this good, and then it was below expectations. So there's this error term that says, brain says, hey, pay attention, learn something. This isn't as good as you expected. And what that does is say, hey, that's not that great. And we start to become disenchanted with the behavior. We've done the same thing with overeating. So with our Eat Right Now app, for example, we built in this craving tool that has people pay attention as they overeat. So they're not just doing it mindlessly. And so they can really line up how rewarding it is. So if overeating is great, they're going to get a positive prediction error that says, that's awesome, do it again. Nobody gets that because overeating doesn't feel awesome, right? So they get this negative prediction error, and we can actually map out and graph out how quickly that reward value drops below zero. Are you ready for this? 10 to 15 times. It only takes 10 to 15 times for our brains to update that reward value and shift behavior. Which, of course, if you look at it from an evolutionary perspective, we don't have 20 times to get chased by the saber-toothed tiger to learn that it's dangerous. Our brains have to be tremendously plastic so that we can adapt to our environment. It's just that we form these habits and we become complacent, and we don't pay attention until something, really dangerous happens. And then it's often, challenging, like we have a big medical issue that comes from smoking or overeating or whatever. So here, we can really tap into that power of our brain and how strong that learning mechanism is. And the nice thing about it is, we don't have to get surgery. We don't have to get some, brain implant. All we need is one simple ingredient, which is awareness. We just have to pay attention. If we don't pay attention, we're going to keep that old reward value and we're going to keep doing it. If we focus on willpower, we're going to get stuck focusing on the wrong thing. But if we just pay attention and ask ourselves, what am I getting from this? Then we can feel into our direct experience. It's not an intellectual, like, I know smoking is bad for me, but it's like, oh, this doesn't taste very good. When we pay attention there, that's when that reward value updates and we start to become disenchanted with that behavior. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's what's so revolutionary about the way you talk about this is so much of habit change is around willpower or shaping the environment or whatever else. And this idea that like you can actually just give your lower brain direct access to the experience and it will learn in the way that it has learned for, millions of years, and it isn't an effort of willpower. And I don't know if you want to just talk briefly, you sort of talked about how the prefrontal cortex is evolutionarily newer and weaker than other brain areas. And so it's always going to be an uphill battle to try to use willpower. And if you want to share a little bit about that.
Sure. Just briefly, the prefrontal cortex from an evolutionary perspective is really the youngest and the weakest part of the brain. And it's been shown pretty clearly that it goes offline when we get stressed. And so, stress leads to everything from relapse in drugs to eating to smoking to worrying. And so here we are saying, well, just use your willpower, assuming that it's a real thing. And then it says, okay, use it at the time when you can't use it, because the prefrontal cortex tends to be the seat of cognitive control. So it's we're setting ourselves up to fail, even though it makes a lot of sense. Like, oh yeah, just don't do it. It's not really how our brains work.
Yeah. No, I think that's what's really powerful, paying attention to the actual experience. I had one question on the eating piece of another factor I often think about with food is that when we evolved in an environment where there weren't enough calories. And so it was very adaptive to want as much fat and as much sugar as you could possibly have. The modern world is a very different environment where there's an excess of fat and sugar. So I've often thought of it that way too, where like our instincts didn't evolve in the current environment. But are you saying that like if we fully pay attention to our instincts around like when we go from craving to feeling satiated, that is enough in terms of health? Or do we have to also layer in some of the kind of higher level prefrontal cortex cognition around, oh, this is probably not good for my long-term health?
Yeah, it's a great question. The way I think of this is our feeling bodies are much stronger and much wiser than our thinking brains. And so they know if we just give ourselves a chance to listen to our bodies, we know when we're full. We know when something tastes crappy, And so I think of it this way. Let's use eating as an example. If we pay attention, there's this thing I call it the pleasure plateau, where, it's pleasurable. And then at some point, even the same food is going to taste less pleasurable because our body says, okay, I've had enough. We hit that plateau. And if we're not paying attention, we're just going to zoom off that I call it the cliff of overindulgence. And then we wake up from our stupor and we're like, what happened? And then we go do it again because we haven't learned to make that association. Yeah. So it's really good in that sense, we don't need to have to learn something intellectually. We don't have to be, a very smart person. We just have to be embodied. We just have to really pay attention and listen to our bodies. And then we start to learn to trust them. They're actually, much more trustworthy than our thinking brain, which is always saying, oh, try this, try this, try this.
Yeah. Thank you. It's really helpful. All right. So the final gear is third gear, which you refer to as the big, better offer. And so we've been talking about how, anytime we're trying to decide what to do, our brain is sort of evaluating all the different projected reward values of every behavior, and that we need to update the reward value of these learned behaviors to say, actually, like maybe worrying or procrastinating or having a second piece of cake isn't going to feel as good as I thought of. So we talked about updating those reward values, but you also talk about needing to add in new behaviors that have an even higher reward value than the ones we've tried so far. And so can you tell us a little bit about that? Like, what have you seen with your patients in terms of what is the bigger, better offer in terms of new behaviors that they could try?
Yeah, well, one thing that I've seen that doesn't work is where somebody substitutes one behavior with another, and that loop is still kind of in place. So I see this a lot with addiction treatment where somebody replaces, cocaine with exercise. And so, they say, oh, when I feel this urge to use cocaine, I'm just going to exercise. Or when I feel this urge to whatever, I'm just going to, eat. The problem there is that it doesn't dismantle the loop itself, and in fact can lead to, the simple definition of addiction is continued use despite adverse consequences. So people can get addicted to exercise, for example, and then if they get injured, their body says, oh, wow, now I'm craving both my substance and the exercise and I can't have either. And then it, often leads to relapse. So that substitution strategy doesn't tend to work very well. Certainly, eating carrot sticks is healthier than smoking cigarettes for sure. And so that's, how some people will quit smoking. But ultimately, we've really got to dismantle that loop itself. And so the way to do that is to find intrinsically rewarding behaviors, quote unquote behaviors. And they've got to be intrinsically rewarding, because then they don't become habituated. We don't need more and more and more, and we don't spin those habit loops. The two flavors that I find most helpful, in our research, has backed this up, is that, we have this ability to be curious, and we have this ability to be kind. So, for example, if somebody is anxious, they can, anxiety can trigger them to worry, and then they can spin out in that loop. Or in that moment when somebody's anxious, they, instead of that, oh no, what's wrong? They can go, oh, what's this? And drop into their direct experience and get curious about what that anxiety feels like in their body. Or if they're habitually overeating, or they have a craving to eat some, junk food, and instead of indulging that craving, they can get curious. Oh, what does this craving actually feel like in my body? And then they can compare, what does craving feel like compared to curiosity? Well, curiosity feels better. It's a no-brainer. What does, worrying feel like compared to curiosity? Curiosity feels better. It's a no-brainer. So it in itself is this intrinsically rewarding mental behavior that we can tap into, that not only feels better than the old behaviors. That's why I call it the bigger, better offer, because it's better. It feels better, but it's also helps us step out of these old habit loops. So it serves it's a twofer. And, you can't get too curious, and there are all sorts of great quotes about curiosity, like when James Stevens wrote, curiosity will conquer fear even more than bravery will. So if we're, if we're afraid, we can get curious. Or if we're bored, there's a quote like, curiosity will conquer boredom. There is no cure, or curiosity will cure boredom. There is no cure for curiosity, and so it's like, there's a great intrinsically rewarding tool that we have, that we always have. And it's just a matter of awakening. So that's one flavor that I really think of curiosity as a superpower. And it fits, if you look at Buddhist psychology, that's really the heart of, of awareness, is like having this curious, open-minded, non-judgmental attitude. Yeah. So that's one piece. We can talk about kindness in a minute, but I want to pause there.
Yeah, and I love the point that you made, that it's a twofer, in the sense that, like, it's the curiosity that's bringing the awareness. So you're realizing, here's how I feel when I procrastinate. Here's how I feel when I don't. Here's how I feel when I worry. Here's how I feel when I have a cigarette, whatever. So it's actually like the means by which you're giving yourself information about the results of your behaviors, and then it's also in and of itself intrinsically satisfying. So I really like that component. And then, did you want to add on with kindness as well?
Sure. So kindness, also a superpower. One of the most common habit loops that I see is self-judgment. We're really good. I'll extend that, judgment in general. In the Western world, we're really good at judging. So whether we're judging others, and social media is great at kind of piling that on itself, or judging ourselves, we get in these habit loops. So we have this thought, and then we think, oh, why did I do that? Why didn't I do that? All the shoulds come out. I should have done this. I shouldn't have done that. What's the joke? We should all over ourselves. So that habit loops get spinning. And so we can map, first gear, map it out. Second gear, ask, what am I getting from beating myself up? And then we can say, okay, brain, what do you like more? Beating yourself up, judging yourself, or being kind to yourself? Another no-brainer. It kindness just feels better. And if we can't remember the last time we were kind to ourselves, we can just remember the last time somebody was kind to us. It could be the simplest act of kindness where somebody just held the door for us. Oh, what's it feel like when somebody's kind to me? It's like, oh, it's a relief. It just feels good.
Yeah.
So we can start to bring kindness in as a bigger, better offer as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting. We're doing a lot of self-compassion training at Google, just realizing like how fundamental that compassion to yourself as a starting point is for so many other foundational mental health needs. And one thing that we'll sometimes hear is similar to what you were saying earlier about people seeing the value of anxiety. There can be a fear, if I'm too kind with myself, that I won't work hard. If I have self-compassion, I won't work hard. So can you speak to that and kind of the misconception there?
I would be happy to. I'm so glad you bring this up. This is really important. So this is really the critical distinction between self-indulgence and self-care.
Mm.
So, if we're, I don't know, we have the habit of, eating 3 helpings of ice cream when, that we've gone way beyond that pleasure plateau. And so, our brain could say, oh, you're being kind to yourself by eating this ice cream, or eating ice cream when you're stressed, or something like that. But we're not actually caring for ourselves, because it's not getting at the root of the thing that triggered that behavior in the first place. So it's really important to be able to ask ourselves a simple question, not what do I want, because the want drives us. It's that dopamine drive that says, I want this, go get it. It's really about, what do I need? And asking ourselves that question, and really, really sitting with it and seeing what comes up. So if I need some connection, ice cream isn't really a connection. It's a habit. And so we can say, oh, I'm feeling lonely. And so then we can call a friend, or, go and snuggle with a pet or something like that, where we actually meet that need instead of indulging that want. And that's the critical distinction between self-indulgence and self-care. Self-care, really helpful. Self-indulgence tends to just feed these habits.
Yeah. No, that's a really, really helpful clarification. So I have 2 more questions, and then we'll go to the audience. So reminder for everyone to add questions to the YouTube chat. So coming back to anxiety specifically, so you told a really powerful story about a patient struggling with anxiety who was really focused on the why. And so this is a passage from the book where you said she had gone down the rabbit hole of why. She was desperately trying to figure out why she was anxious, thinking that when she got the answer, she could fix it and her anxiety would go away. We think that if we can identify these triggers, we can either avoid them in the future, or better yet, fix them. And then we get stuck in trying to fix the past. And I think this is so common for people who struggle with anxiety and worry, and would love to sort of hear you tell us what you did with that patient and with your patients more generally to help her take a more productive path.
Yeah. So the first thing here is to really help ourselves understand why we get stuck in these why habit loops. And the general problem is that our brain says, I just want something that's going to make this go away forever. So if I can find what that reason is, I can somehow solve it. And I laugh because life isn't, we can't just solve a constantly changing experience that is life. And we can't, if we find something that triggers us, we can't necessarily avoid. Sometimes we can avoid triggers, but we can't go through life just constantly trying to avoid triggers. What we can do is empower ourselves to have be able to work with something that triggers us. That's what gives us, autonomy. That's what gives us confidence. That's what gives us self-efficacy. So here, I start by having my patients map out these why habit loops and help them, really see for themselves. So this comes from them, just me asking questions like, well, what is it? What are you looking for in there? And it basically comes out some flavor of, well, if I could just find this, I could fix it. If I can find it, I can fix it. And so people spend endless years diving back into their past to try to figure out, well, especially with the past, the problem is there's nothing we can do about our past. We can honor our experience in the past, but we can't change it. What we can change is the present. And if we change something in the present, we can affect the future. And that's where things get really powerful. So here we can help people honor their past, get out of those why habit loops and into the what of the present moment. So when I'm anxious, what does this feel like right now? And they can bring in curiosity. Oh, what's this feel? Oh, where do I feel this? Oh, do I feel this here, here, here? What that does is help them step out of the why habit loop in the present moment and not feed it, and also feed that new habit of curiosity.
That's great. And I found that very powerful and I think at another point in the book, you said the least important part of the habit loop is the trigger. The trigger is just what gets you there, but then it's how you respond is where all the power is.
Yeah. If I can just repeat that, because that's really, really important. The trigger is the least important part. And it's our brains that want to come in and try to fix or solve things like, oh, trigger. Guess what? Reward-based learning is called reward-based learning. It's not called trigger-based learning, right? Yeah. It's based on how rewarding a behavior is. That's what's going to drive future behavior. That's how reinforcement learning works. So the triggers just happen to be the thing that gets associated with spinning the loop. It's really about focusing on the behavior and the result. What's the result of the behavior? That's where we get those positive and negative prediction errors. It has nothing to do with the trigger in terms of changing the behavior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very critical. And then final question for me before we go to the audience is, I think a lot of people listening to this call are personally struggling with anxiety or panic attacks like right now and today. What advice would you give to someone kind of distilling what we've talked about in this past 45 minutes? What advice would you give for someone who's just starting and who wants to kind of start down this path of interacting with their anxiety in a different way?
I would say first, you're not alone. Often people feel like, oh, this is only happening to me. It's not, there's something wrong with me. So notice that and know that you're not alone, right? This happens to, I don't know anybody that's never had any anxiety. Let's just put it that way. And, the pandemic spiked anxiety levels. Those anxiety levels it seems like the trends are that they're still pretty high. Lots of uncertainty out there. And so I would say, don't give up hope, but really focus on getting curious about how, like learning how your mind works. And there can be many ways to do that. And that's why I like the simple place of starting by just mapping out habit loops. Just mapping out these loops is tremendously empowering. It's kind of like we've been walking around in a dark room, bumping into things our entire lives. And we're like, what was that? What was that? And then we try to avoid those things, but we're not oriented. Just mapping out these loops is like flipping on the light switch. And suddenly we can see the terrain. We can see the territory. We can see all the things that we're bumping into. And when we see those and start to see those habit patterns, that's what gives us the power to start to work with our mind instead of, kind of fighting against it or bumbling around in the dark. And that's where, asking these questions like, what am I getting from this? And then finding the bigger, better offer. That's something that anybody can do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And going back to what you said earlier about just how intrinsically motivating curiosity is, like just sort of in that moment saying, how does this feel right now in my body? And just approaching that with curiosity. Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you so much. So let's go to some of the audience questions. All right. So from Dirk, what if curiosity doesn't help you as a better option? For example, I know what anxiety feels like in my body. I can't really get more curious about it or find it to be any more enjoyable.
That's a really good question. So here, one distinction to make is there are two types of curiosity. One's called deprivation curiosity. One's called interest curiosity. Deprivation curiosity is what it sounds like. When we're deprived of information, that's when our brain says, go get that information. Interest curiosity is just the act of being interested in something and curious about it. And I think of it, deprivation is like the destination. When we get the information, we've arrived at our destination, that deprivation is gone and we're back to baseline. Interest curiosity is more like the journey. It's like we have no destination in mind. We're just really curious about it. So here, if, is similar, and I get similar questions to what Dirk pointed out, if we can't find that we can be more curious, we can ask ourselves, what's it feel like not to be curious? And that kind of creates this koan for our brain, so that we can start to see what interest curiosity itself really, truly feels like. And with anxiety itself, we have this tool, we call it the stress tool that's built into the Unwinding Anxiety program. We have people feel into where anxiety feels in their body and then ask simple question like, is it more on the right side or the left side? Is it more in the front or is it more in the back, right? And here it awakens our curiosity. Is it more on the right or the left? Is it more in the front or the back? And what that can do is just help us start to get a taste of what curiosity feels like. Because when anxiety is really strong, it often crowds out that curiosity. And it's not like we can instantly be like, okay, now my curiosity is at 100. It tends to take some training to build that up. And that's why, with the systematic training around the curiosity can be helpful. It's not just that, suddenly I can tap into my inherent capacity to be curious. So for Dirk and anybody else that's struggling with that, this is, I love the question of like, well, what's it feel like not to be curious? And that can start to awaken that interest type of curiosity that we're talking about. And then if we can awaken that, like, I don't know, that tends to be a sign that we're starting to get curious. Another way that we can kind of get a sense for, a signpost is what our mind is saying in the tone of voice. So it's like, oh no, there's anxiety. Or we can go, oh, there's anxiety. And that, oh, is a sign that like, oh, what does this feel like? That's when we're getting into the interest curiosity territory. It's very different than the deprivation curiosity, which is more of a driven, restless quality to it.
The other thing that this reminds me of that you mentioned in your book is that sometimes, I think you were talking about the RAIN exercise, like sometimes there can be the misconception that like, if we're having a difficult emotion and we're mindful, it will go away. Yeah. And you talk a little bit about how that's not necessarily the case. And it's more like changing our relationship with that experience.
Yes, that's a really important point, which is often we think, oh, I'm going to use curiosity as like the anxiety eraser.
Right, like, right, yeah.
Oh, now my anxiety's gone forever, right? It's back to that, our brain not wanting to have this. But if there's something that's unpleasant, it could be anxiety or something else, and our brain says, this doesn't feel good, we might say, I don't want this to be here, so I'm going to do something to make it go away. That's a sign that we're resisting our present moment experience. So mindfulness and curiosity are about the opposite, where we're welcoming in our present moment experience. And so here it's really important to check in to see if we're resisting and doing something in order to make the anxiety go away. That's not what these practices are about. They're about learning to relate to our experience differently so that we can welcome everything in. And in this sense, there are these sayings like the only way out is through, right? We can't avoid anxiety. We can't make it go away. But if we open to it, if we turn toward it, and we see that it in itself is just made up of thoughts and sensations, and they aren't as bad as our mind makes them out to be, suddenly their power diminishes. And we can learn, okay, this is unpleasant, but I can buckle my seatbelt, and that curiosity helps me ride it out instead of being consumed by it or being consumed by ways to try to make it go away. So that's really important. This is about changing our relationship to our thoughts and emotions. It's not about changing our experience. But paradoxically, by changing our relationship, our experience changes. We just can't force it to change.
No, thank you. All right, next question from Kieran. Your colleague at Brown Willoughby Britton has done some interesting research about the adverse impacts of mindfulness. Is there such a thing as taking mindfulness too far? When does that occur?
It's a really good question. So a lot of work has been done, and Willoughby has been one of the leaders in this field around what might be the circumstances around which somebody might struggle with the mindfulness training. And she's mostly studied experienced practitioners, teachers, and people that have gone through these, kind of these 8-week intensive programs. And so here, if somebody has a trauma history, for example, that it might be a contraindication for somebody to really, to just kind of dive into one of these courses or even to an app-based mindfulness training blindly. So here, it's interesting, if you look historically, people have typically been supported by teachers when they've started doing these practices. And in the West, where it's kind of more of a consumerist mindset, where we're like, I'm just going to buy this and do it, the support mechanisms may not be as strong. So it's really important to, if somebody struggles, for example, has a trauma history, they've got adequate support as they're starting to do these things. I think of this as kind of muddy waters where things can, it's like, things can get stirred up. And if we don't know how to have the emotion regulation capacities to work with them, it can feel like things are getting worse. In our studies, we monitor adverse events and find that, there are no unexpected adverse events, but we do find with our anxiety program that people will report that their anxiety is a little bit stronger at first, a little bit higher. And that we expect people to start noticing what anxiety actually feels like, especially if they've been avoiding it their whole life. And the good news is we can give them that support to be able to be with it and let that go downstream. So I think of it as, the analogy I use is muddy waters, where, you kick up the mud and suddenly the water's muddy and you're like, where'd all this mud come from? The water was clear. But if we have those emotion regulation capacities starting to build, and that's what mindfulness training really can help us do, that mud washes downstream. And we have the capability so that when the dirt comes in the future, it doesn't get laid down as mud. And so we can learn to work with, even very strong things that come at us.
Great, thank you. All right, next question from Bud. First, I love your program and it changed my life. Thank you. Second, how do you see the correlation of anxiety and ADHD?
That's a really good question. So, not being an epidemiologist, I can't answer the specifics of how correlated those two are. I would guess that there's some correlation between them, and especially experientially, where anxiety has this restless driven quality to it that says, go get information. And ADHD has this restless driven quality to it as well. And for some people, it's just the emotional flavor of like, they're, this. With ADHD, where it's like, with anxiety. But that restless quality, I think, is a very shared physiologic experience. And glad to hear the program was helpful. That's always great to hear.
Great, thank you. All right, do we have another question? From Brendan. How important is developing distress tolerance to countering habit-related anxiety? And are there concrete strategies to improve distress tolerance, in particular during an anxiety wave?
Yeah, I would say in life in general, developing distress tolerance is really helpful. And these Cornel West calls our phones our weapons of mass distraction. It's so easy in modern day to learn to just turn to our phone to distract ourselves. I'm going to check my email. We rationalize it. It's really good. I'm going to check my email. I'm going to check my Slack. I'm going to go look at a YouTube video or something like that when I'm feeling uncomfortable. So we actually learn to distract ourselves. So that's the opposite of distress tolerance. So I would say distress tolerance is critical, not only for anxiety, but for everyday life. And here I would say, mindfulness training, one of the common mechanisms has been, that's been kind of shown over and over, is that it's a really good emotion regulation strategy. And I think of it as a really good distress tolerance strategy. So when something is distressing, our survival brain says, oh no, that's unpleasant, make it go away. And our mindfulness brain, let's put it that way, when we learn the power of curiosity, we can go, instead of going, oh no, we can go, oh. And that helps us open to it. So, and when we can open to something, that is a tremendously powerful form of distress tolerance, because we don't have to, if we're truly opening our awareness and opening our arms to something, we don't have to push against it. We don't have to tolerate, I'm going to just grit my teeth and tolerate this a little bit longer. Bring it on, let it be here all day. We welcome it in. And this goes back, I love this. There's a poem from Rumi that's really famous called The Guest House, where he talks about, I'm terrible at quoting poems, so I won't, but, to summarize, he talks about, welcome all these negative emotions in, they could be guests sent from beyond to help you basically sweep your house clean and help you learn. And so we even see, what we think of as a bad or a negative emotion, we can see it as like, oh, here's something really strong. And here's something that can help me learn how I deal with the world, which I can then generalize, and learn from that. And we become wise based on things like anxiety. So we can even start to see them as teachers and say, okay, here it is. What can I learn from this about how to work with strong emotions? Oh, what does anxiety feel like? And so curiosity, for example, is a really good distress tolerance tool.
I love that. Yeah. It reminds me, there's this book called Care for the Soul. I don't know if I think it's by Thomas More, but it's all about like how we just have this tendency to say, oh, I want joy and hope and happiness and ecstasy. And I don't want any fear or pain and he just talks about just the sort of beauty and power of leaning into it all, like leaning into all of the emotions. All right, I think we have a few more questions, so let's keep going. So how does awareness increase, and does meditation help?
So the second question, how does meditation help? It helps us train to be aware, and awareness increases through. So if you look at the historic, the Buddhist psychology and the early sutras, they talk about previous moments of awareness will be more, be predictors of future moments of awareness, which kind of seems like chicken and egg. So if you look at it from a brain's perspective, we're going to keep doing behaviors. We're going to even do behaviors more if they're rewarding. And so here, how can we increase awareness, and how does meditation help? We can practice being curious about our experience, and we can notice what it feels like to be truly present, for example, versus lost. We can notice what it feels like to be truly present or aware of anxiety, and have that hold the anxiety as compared to, fighting against it. And anytime we notice the reward of being aware, anytime we notice the reward of curiosity, it's going to become that bigger, better offer, and it'll start to feed on itself. So that develops a virtuous cycle where previous moments of curiosity, when we reflect on them and say, what did I get from that? Oh, it felt good. They're more likely to say, okay, do that again. And our brain's going to start to get in this virtuous cycle where it says, hey, let's bring on that curiosity. Let's keep doing that. If we try to force awareness or force curiosity, and I can speak from my own personal experience about this. Like, I used to sweat through t-shirts in the middle of winter on these long meditation retreats, trying to pay attention. It doesn't work. That's not how our brains work. Instead, we can tap into that intrinsic, I think of it as curiosity as that intrinsic superpower. And when we see that it's rewarding, it's going to be self-reinforcing. And that's really what mindfulness is about, is that curious awareness, that awareness that has that attitude of non-judgmental curiosity.
Thank you. So we'll do one more question and then we will close. So final question is from Gregory. How can we stop ruminating on the past or fixating on mistakes that may have led to trauma?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So here, I was just thinking about somebody that I had a conversation with who had talked about his childhood trauma, and he was, he had been his mechanism as a kid to survive, because children don't have control over their situations, and people who've had trauma, generally don't have control over what happened. But that doesn't stop people from kind of blaming themselves or forming some type of survival, really a coping mechanism that's helped, and they feel like that's helped them survive, And so this gentleman, for example, had developed the survival mechanism, worrying. He would worry, and he was thinking that the worry was going to keep him safe, throughout life. And he kept this for, 50 years, for a long time. So what we explored together was honoring that child that was doing the best that it could, because he didn't want to just dismiss himself, his childhood self, but at the same time, he wanted to move on. And so we talked about this in terms of, both honoring the past, but also seeing how that might not be helping us now. And one way that I think about this is, we've worn a pair of shoes that fits and are very comfortable, but at the time they don't fit now. We've outgrown those shoes. And so in fact, we keep putting them on even though it's painful. And so it's actually not helping us in the present moment to be doing those coping mechanisms that might have helped us in the past. So here we honor the past and we acknowledge, and we say, okay, is this helping me now? Is this meeting my needs now? And often whatever these coping mechanisms are, sometimes they're not helping. So for this gentleman, worrying wasn't helping him. And so in real time, we did this on a live group, basically helped him start to then say, okay, I can let go of that and I can move forward in the present moment and work with the worry as a habit loop. And that just gave him tremendous self-efficacy to be able to say, okay, I can honor this and I can work with this. And these are two very different things. So for anybody that struggled, and unfortunately trauma is way too prevalent, there's just way too much of it out in the world, there is hope where we can start to really, work with these, and of course, having really good support mechanisms can be very, very helpful for this. But we can learn to move on. And one of the issues is getting stuck in the past.
Beautifully said. Thank you. So Dr. Jud, thank you so much. I have really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you for taking the time. In closing, can you let people know how they can find you, how they can find your work?
Oh, sure. I have a website, drjud.com, drjud.com. I'm on Twitter at Jud Brewer, Judbrewer. But the website has got a bunch of free resources, the books, the apps, anything else that folks might be looking for.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.